100,000 men, every single one of them hungry, every single day. No refrigerated trucks, no canned food, no supply apps, no logistics software, just dust, heat, and an empire that could not afford to stop moving. The Ottoman army on campaign wasn't just a military force. It was a city, walking across continents. A city that needed to eat, drink, sleep, and fight simultaneously. Most people think great empires were built with swords. They weren't. They were built with flour, lentils, and an administrative machine so precise it would make modern military planners nervous. This is not the story of the battles. This is the story of what made the battles possible. The invisible engine running beneath every Ottoman conquest. And almost no textbook bothers to mention it. Before a single arrow flew, before a single cannon roared, someone had already calculated exactly how much bread 100,000 soldiers would consume in 40 days. Someone had contracted the bakers, organized the mules, negotiated the grain prices, mapped the water sources. That someone wasn't a general, that someone was a bureaucrat. And he may have been the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. If you've never heard his name, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment below. What hidden system do you want us to expose next? Forget everything you think you know about an Ottoman military campaign. Forget the soldiers. Forget the weapons. Look instead at what's moving behind them. For every 10 soldiers marching toward the enemy, there were roughly 7 support personnel walking alongside. Cooks, drivers, animal handlers, blacksmiths, surgeons, merchants, priests. An army wasn't a fighting force, it was a civilization in motion. At peak campaign strength, the Ottoman war machine moved with approximately 100,000 fighting men. Add the support column. Add the animals, horses, camels, oxen, mules, numbering well over 50,000. Now you have something closer to a medium-sized European city crossing the Balkans on foot. And that city needed to eat. Every single day, without exception, without negotiation, without delay. Here's the number that stops people cold. A campaign army of this scale consumed roughly 500 tons of food and fodder, daily, not weekly, not monthly, daily. No railway, no combustion engine, no refrigeration, just roads, many of them unpaved, and an organizational infrastructure that had been refined over 2 centuries of constant warfare. This is where the story gets interesting. Because the Ottomans didn't improvise. They didn't loot their way across Europe hoping to find enough grain. They engineered their supply chain the same way they engineered their fortresses, with cold, precise, almost obsessive calculation. The system had a name. It was called the Aish, the provisioning apparatus, and it was arguably more sophisticated than anything operating in Western Europe at the same time. Few people know this, but there was a problem. Actually, several problems. Moving 500 tons of supplies daily across mountainous terrain, through hostile territory, against seasonal weather patterns and crumbling roads, required solving an engineering puzzle that would challenge any modern logistics company. The Ottomans solved it. Not with technology, with system design. And the blueprint they used was hiding in plain sight, buried inside imperial decrees, tax records, and the job descriptions of men whose names history forgot entirely. The campaign hadn't started yet. The soldiers were still in their barracks. The cannons hadn't moved. But somewhere in Istanbul, inside a building most tourists walk past without a second glance, the war had already begun. It began with numbers. Specifically, with a document called the Muhimma Defteri. the Ottoman Imperial Council's register of decisions. Part executive order, part logistics blueprint, part early warning system. One of the most underrated administrative inventions in military history. Inside these registers, Ottoman bureaucrats recorded everything. Which provinces would supply grain? Which roads would carry the wagons? Which local governors were responsible and personally liable if deliveries failed? The paper trail was not bureaucratic excess. It was the empire's immune system. Here's what made the Ottoman provisioning system genuinely remarkable. It operated on a forward deployment model. Supplies weren't gathered at the start of a campaign and dragged along behind the army. They were pre-positioned, stored in fortified magazines called ikmal depolera, weeks or months before the army arrived. Think of it as a logistical relay race. The army marched toward a supply node, consumed what was stored there, moved to the next node, which had already been stocked by a different provincial supply chain running in parallel. The army never waited for food. The food waited for the army. Few people know this, but the Ottomans calculated campaign rations with a specificity that feels almost modern. Each soldier received a daily allocation. Hard, biscuit, dried meat, or legumes, cooking fat, salt. Each animal had its own fodder calculation. Multiply that across 100,000 men and 50,000 animals over a 90-day campaign, and you begin to understand the scale of arithmetic happening inside those candlelit offices. The man responsible for this calculation wasn't a general. He was the defterdar, the imperial treasurer. Essentially, the Ottoman CFO. He didn't carry a sword. He carried an abacus and the authority to bankrupt provincial governors who underperformed, which, historically speaking, may have been the more terrifying weapon. But there was a problem. Pre-positioning supplies required predicting the future. Which route would the army take? Which fortresses would need to be besieged, consuming weeks of unexpected time? Which regions would experience drought, cutting into available grain? The system was precise, but precision and war have a complicated relationship. The Ottomans handled this with a technique modern supply chain managers would instantly recognize: strategic buffer stock. Every magazine held between 20 and 30% more than calculated need, not waste. Insurance. The empire was essentially running a risk management operation disguised as a military campaign. What happened next was surprising. Because the real genius of these Ottoman supply architecture wasn't in the storage. It wasn't even in the calculation. It was in the people tasked with making it function on the ground, in mud, in heat, under enemy harassment, across roads that barely deserved the name. History has a very specific bias. It remembers conquerors. It remembers generals. It occasionally remembers architects. It almost never remembers the man who made sure the conqueror's army didn't starve 3 weeks before the decisive battle. That oversight is one of history's most consequential blind spots. Inside the Ottoman military structure, the supply operation was managed by a dedicated corps of officials called the Ordu Emini, the Army Commissariat. These weren't soldiers who happened to manage supplies. They were trained professionals, administrators, accountants, negotiators, deployed specifically to run the empire's forward logistics operation. Think of them as the Ottoman equivalent of a military logistics command. Except they wore robes instead of armor, and their battlefield was a ledger. The Ordu Emini operated with a layered hierarchy. At the top, a senior commissariat officer reporting directly to the Grand Vizier. Beneath him, regional supply coordinators embedded along the campaign route. Beneath them, local purchasing agents contracted to acquire grain, livestock, and fuel from surrounding villages. Each layer had specific accountability. Each layer had specific consequences for failure. The Ottomans were not sentimental about underperformance. Here's where the system becomes genuinely sophisticated. The Ottomans didn't simply take supplies from conquered or allied territories. They purchased them at rates set by imperial decree. This wasn't generosity. It was strategic intelligence. A farmer who receives fair payment today brings more grain tomorrow. A farmer whose supplies are looted becomes a guerrilla fighter by next week. The Ottomans understood the economics of cooperation 3 centuries before modern counterinsurgency manuals codified it. The primary supply animal of the Ottoman campaign machine was the mule, not the horse, which was expensive, temperamental, and consumed enormous quantities of high-quality fodder. The mule was cheaper, sturdier, more reliable on broken terrain. A single mule could carry approximately 250 kilograms across mountain passes that would stop a wagon entirely. The Ottoman commissariat maintained dedicated mule trains numbering in the thousands, each train managed by specialized handlers who knew their animals the way surgeons know instruments. Few people know this, but the Ottoman Supply Corps also included a remarkable specialization, the ekmekçi, the campaign bakers. Mobile baking units traveled with the army, carrying portable stone ovens that could be assembled and operational within hours of halting. Fresh bread, or more accurately, hard campaign biscuit, was produced continuously during rest periods. The logistics of feeding an oven on campaign were themselves a minor engineering challenge. Fuel had to be sourced, rationed, and transported alongside everything else. The secret was hidden in something seemingly ordinary, the humble peksimet, Ottoman campaign biscuit, hard, dense, practically indestructible. A single soldier's daily ration weighed roughly 700 grams, multiply across 100,000 men. That's 70 metric tons of biscuit, daily, requiring continuous production, storage, and distribution. The peksimet wasn't just food. It was an engineering solution to the impossible mathematics of feeding a moving city. But there was a problem. The commissariat system, brilliant as it was, depended entirely on one critical variable: the speed of the army. Move too fast and the army outran its prepositioned supplies. Move too slow and the supplies spoiled, were consumed by the support column, or were raided by enemy irregulars operating precisely to disrupt the provisioning chain. Speed wasn't just a tactical consideration, it was a logistical constraint. And sometimes, those two requirements pulled in violently opposite directions. The tension between tactical commanders who wanted speed and commissariat officers who demanded discipline created a friction running through every major Ottoman campaign. There are recorded instances, preserved in those same Muhima Defteri registers, of senior supply officials formally petitioning the Grand Vizier to slow the army down. Not because of military risk, because the bread hadn't arrived yet. The fact that these petitions were sometimes granted tells you everything about how seriously the Ottoman High Command took its logistics operation. What happened next was surprising and slightly uncomfortable, because the commissariat system, for all its sophistication, had a structural vulnerability buried at its foundation. A vulnerability that wasn't logistical, wasn't military, wasn't even meteorological. It was entirely human. And it had a name that appears in Ottoman records with an almost rhythmic regularity. That name was corruption. Every system has a breaking point. The Ottomans spent 2 centuries building one of history's most sophisticated military supply architectures. They spent roughly the same amount of time discovering exactly how many ways human beings could quietly dismantle it from the inside. The results were instructive and occasionally catastrophic. The structural weakness wasn't architectural. The magazines were real. The mule trains were real. The bakers were real. The problem was the layer of human beings connecting all those components, specifically the provincial governors, local contractors, and regional purchasing agents who handled imperial money and imperial grain before either reached the army. The distance between Istanbul and a Balkan supply depot was not merely geographical, it was a distance measured in accountability. And accountability, in a pre-telegraph empire, had very specific limits. The corruption followed a remarkably consistent pattern. A provincial governor received an imperial order to deliver 10,000 bushels of grain to a forward magazine. He contracted local merchants to source the grain. The merchants delivered 8,000 bushels and invoiced for 10,000. The governor signed the receipt and pocketed the difference. The magazine recorded 10,000 bushels received. The army arrived expecting 10,000 bushels. The army found 8,000. Somewhere in that gap, between the receipt and the reality, soldiers went hungry, campaigns faltered, and occasionally, history pivoted on a corrupted grain contract. Few people know this, but the Ottoman response to supply corruption was neither passive nor particularly merciful. The empire maintained a dedicated inspection corps, müfettişler, imperial auditors deployed specifically to follow the supply chain and identify discrepancies. These weren't gentle bureaucrats with clipboards. They carried imperial authority to arrest, confiscate, and execute. A provincial governor found guilty of systematic supply fraud didn't receive a fine. He received a considerably more permanent consequence. The Ottomans understood that in a system where corruption could lose a battle, deterrence needed to be proportional to the stakes. But auditors travel slowly. Armies travel faster. And the window between a fraudulent delivery and an imperial inspector's arrival was frequently wide enough to hide a great deal of missing grain. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the Ottomans developed a counter-corruption mechanism that was almost elegant in its simplicity. Redundant sourcing. No single contractor supplied any single magazine exclusively. Multiple suppliers, multiple routes, multiple accountabilities. If one contractor delivered short, the shortfall was partially offset by parallel deliveries from independent sources. The system was designed to fail gracefully, which is sophisticated engineering, regardless of the century. The second category of crisis was meteorological and considerably harder to prosecute. The Ottoman campaign season was deliberately calibrated to avoid winter. Armies typically departed Istanbul in spring and aimed to reach their objectives before autumn made the roads impassable. But the Balkans and Anatolia don't always cooperate with imperial scheduling. Late rains turned supply roads into mud channels that swallowed wagon wheels whole. Early frosts destroyed forward-positioned grain stores before the army arrived to consume them. Drought years reduced provincial grain reserves below the thresholds required to meet imperial requisition orders, leaving governors facing an impossible choice between feeding their own populations and supplying the army. Nature, it turns out, doesn't respond to Muhimme Defteri orders. The third crisis category was military, and the most operationally dangerous. Enemy commanders understood the Ottoman supply architecture well enough to target it deliberately. Hungarian and Habsburg irregular forces, the Uskoks and border raiders, specialized in striking Ottoman supply columns rather than engaging the main army directly. Destroying a mule train carrying 50 tons of grain was strategically more valuable than killing 200 soldiers. It didn't make headlines in the chronicles, but it made the Ottoman army hungry. and a hungry army makes different decisions than a fed one. Slower decisions, more cautious decisions, sometimes fatally cautious decisions. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 offers one of history's most documented examples of Ottoman supply failure reshaping military outcome. Suleiman the Magnificent's army arrived at Vienna's walls having already consumed the campaign's logistical margins. The route through the Balkans had been brutal. Abnormally heavy rains, collapsed bridges, roads that consumed weeks of scheduled travel time. The army reached Vienna later than planned, with less ammunition than calculated, and with supply lines stretched to a fragility that made extended siege operations genuinely dangerous. The heavy artillery, the cannons capable of breaching Vienna's walls, had been partially abandoned along the route because the mud made them impossible to move. Vienna didn't survive because of Austrian courage alone. It survived, in significant part, because Ottoman mud defeated Ottoman logistics. The invisible system had cracked at precisely the wrong moment. But there was a deeper problem, one that the Ottomans never fully solved, and that quietly undermined their Western expansion across generations: the empire's logistical radius. Every supply system has a maximum effective range, the distance beyond which the cost of moving supplies begins to consume the supplies themselves. For the Ottoman war machine, that radius was approximately 1,000 kilometers from Istanbul. Beyond that threshold, the mathematics became brutal. Animals carrying fodder consumed their own cargo before reaching the front. Wagons carrying grain required more grain to fuel the oxen pulling them than they delivered. The system began eating itself. Vienna sat at the very edge of that radius, which means the Ottoman Empire's western frontier wasn't determined by military capacity. It was determined by the caloric mathematics of mule transportation. Empires, it turns out, have edges, and those edges are drawn not by generals, but by supply officers doing arithmetic in candlelit offices. What happened next was surprising, not because the Ottomans failed to recognize the problem, but because of what they built in response to it. Because the empire didn't accept its logistical radius as a permanent ceiling, it engineered around it. With a solution so practical, so unglamorous, and so effective that it quietly shaped Ottoman military capability for another century, and left a physical legacy still visible across the Balkans today. The Ottomans didn't solve their logistical radius problem by marching faster. They didn't solve it by recruiting more mules. They solved it the way every genuinely sophisticated civilization solves infrastructure problems, by permanently embedding the solution into the landscape itself. What they built was called the menzil system, and it was one of the most consequential logistical innovations of the early modern world. Almost no one outside specialist academia has heard of it. A menzil was a way station. But calling it a way station the way you'd call the Sistine Chapel a ceiling painting captures the form while missing the point entirely. The menzil wasn't simply a rest stop. It was a fully integrated logistical node, combining a fortified grain magazine, a courier relay station, a veterinary facility for draft animals, a repair workshop for wagons and equipment, accommodation for supply personnel, and a command post for regional commissariat officers. Each menzil was positioned at precisely calculated intervals along campaign routes, roughly 1 day's march apart. The army never needed to carry more than 1 day's supplies at a time, because the next node was always exactly 1 day ahead. The engineering implications were staggering. By pre-positioning supplies across a permanent network of hardened nodes, the Ottomans effectively multiplied their logistical radius without increasing their supply column. An army marching through a menzil network didn't drag its food behind it. It moved through a food system that was already in place. The supply chain wasn't following the army. The army was moving through the supply chain. That conceptual inversion, from mobile logistics to embedded logistics, is the Ottoman contribution to military science that history textbooks consistently fail to mention. The Menzel network also solved the corruption problem with elegant structural logic. Each node was independently stocked, independently audited, and independently accountable. A fraud at one node didn't cascade through the entire system. It created a localized shortfall that parallel nodes could partially offset. The redundancy wasn't accidental. It was designed. The Ottomans had essentially built fault tolerance into their supply architecture 3 centuries before the concept appeared in engineering literature. Few people know this, but the principles are identical. The courier dimension of the Menzel system deserves its own documentary entirely, because the way stations didn't only move food, they moved information. Imperial dispatches traveled through the Menzel relay network at speeds that stunned contemporary European observers. A message from the front lines could reach Istanbul in days, where weeks or months were the European standard for equivalent distances. The Ottoman Empire was, in a very specific sense, running a real-time information network across territories that dwarfed most European kingdoms. The Sultan in Istanbul knew what was happening on the Danube before many European monarchs knew what was happening in their own provinces. That informational advantage wasn't military technology. It was logistical infrastructure repurposed as a communications network. The same roads that moved grain moved intelligence. The same nodes that stored flour stored dispatches. The Menzel system was, simultaneously, a supply chain and an internet. A very slow, very stone-built internet, but functionally, an internet. This is where the story connects to something larger. The Menzel principle, pre-positioned nodes, embedded logistics, redundant supply paths, didn't disappear when the Ottoman Empire eventually contracted and collapsed. It became a template. Habsburg military engineers studied Ottoman supply organization deliberately, adapting its core architecture for their own frontier, defense systems. Russian imperial logistics borrowed heavily from Ottoman way station principles during the expansion across Central Asia. The British Army's depot system in India, one of the most sophisticated colonial logistics operations in history, shows structural similarities to the Menzel network that are too consistent to be coincidental. Empires learn from empires, usually without acknowledging the source. The secret was hidden in something seemingly ordinary: the physical landscape of southeastern Europe and Anatolia. Travel through Bulgaria, Serbia, northern Greece, or western Turkey today, and you will encounter, with suspicious regularity, old stone structures in small towns that locals call by various names: a caravanserai, a han, an old government building of uncertain purpose. Many of them are Ottoman Menzel stations, still standing, still marking the intervals of a logistical network that hasn't functioned for over a century, but that shaped the geography of roads, towns, and trade routes across an entire continent. The Ottoman supply chain didn't just feed an army. It built the infrastructure skeleton of southeastern Europe, the roads we drive on, the towns that grew around way station settlements, the trade, corridors that became modern highways. All of it tracing, at some ancestral level, the geometry of a commissariat officer's campaign plan. But there was a final, deeply uncomfortable legacy. The Ottoman Menzel system required something that no engineering blueprint could provide: the compelled participation of subject populations. Provincial communities along campaign routes were legally obligated to contribute labor, grain, animals, and housing to the supply network through a system called avarus, extraordinary imperial taxation. It wasn't voluntary. It wasn't always fair. And the burden fell most heavily on agricultural communities that had the least political power to resist it. The logistical miracle of the Ottoman campaign machine was partially funded by the involuntary contributions of Balkan and Anatolian peasant farmers who received imperial receipts in exchange for grain they couldn't always spare. The system was sophisticated. It was also extractive. Both things were simultaneously true. And both things matter when we assess what imperial logistics actually cost, not in treasury expenditure, but in human terms. What happened next was surprising, historically speaking. Because the Ottoman Empire's eventual military decline in the 17th and 18th centuries wasn't primarily caused by inferior weapons, inferior soldiers, or inferior strategy. It was caused, in significant part, by the calcification of the mensal system itself. The network that had been the empire's greatest logistical asset gradually became its most significant constraint. Campaign routes were increasingly dictated by the location of existing mensal nodes rather than by tactical or strategic logic. Commanders chose objectives that the supply network could reach rather than objectives that military advantage recommended. The infrastructure that had enabled Ottoman expansion eventually began, directing Ottoman strategy, a bureaucratic tail wagging a military dog across an empire that could no longer afford to build new nodes faster than its frontiers were moving. The system didn't fail dramatically. It aged. It stiffened. It stopped being an asset and became a ceiling, which is, arguably, the most Ottoman way possible for an empire to slow down. The viewer should leave this chapter with one image fixed in mind. Not a battle, not a sultan, not a cannon, a mule. Walking at approximately 4 kilometers per hour along a stone road through the Balkans, carrying 250 kilograms of hard biscuit toward a way station where 100,000 men are waiting. The mule doesn't know it's part of an empire. It doesn't know it's part of history. It knows the road. It knows the wait. It knows the next stop. That mule, and the 10,000 like it, and the commissariat officer who calculated exactly how many mules were needed, and the baker who turned raw grain into portable calories, and the auditor who checked the manifest against the delivery. Those are the people who built the Ottoman Empire. The generals got the monuments. The logistics officers got the ledgers. History, as usual, got the story backwards. Empires are not built by the men who appear in paintings. They are built by the men who calculated how much bread those men would need to reach the place where the painting eventually happened. The Ottoman war machine fed 100,000 soldiers across impossible terrain using pre-positioned nodes, redundant supply paths, embedded logistics networks, and a bureaucratic accountability system sharp enough to execute governors for arithmetic fraud. No algorithm, no satellite, no combustion engine, just system design, relentlessly refined across 2 centuries of operational experience. The sophistication wasn't in the weapons, it was in the thinking. Every modern supply chain, every supermarket shelf reliably stocked, every hospital with medications precisely where they need to be, every military force capable of sustained operations beyond its home territory, is running, at its conceptual foundation, on principles the Ottoman commissariat would recognize instantly. Preposition, redundate, audit, adapt. The vocabulary changed. The mathematics scaled. The core logic remained identical. We didn't invent modern logistics. We inherited it from empires that learned, through catastrophic trial and expensive error, that the army which eats consistently defeats the army that fights brilliantly, every single time. So the next time you pass a supermarket, or watch a cargo ship cross a harbor, or receive a package delivered with suspicious precision, consider the Ottoman commissariat officer bent over his ledger in candlelight, calculating mule loads and magazine capacities for a campaign that hasn't started yet. He never got a monument. He never got a chronicle. He got a receipt and an empire that kept moving. That was always the real power, not the sword, the system behind it. If this story changed how you think about history, share it with someone who still believes empires were built by generals. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, which hidden system do you want us to expose next? The answer might surprise you. It usually does.